Everyone in Kerazoo had a story about Hank Mitchell. Some said he was a war medic turned animal doctor. Others that he just drank alone and wrote letters to ghosts. But none of them knew he still kept his son's dog tags under his pillow, or that he hadn't opened a veterinary case since Jamie died overseas. So when he knelt beside a dying elephant and whispered, "Come on, big guy," no one realized he wasn't just saving the animal. He was saving the last part of himself. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The air over New Mexico shimmered with a heat so dry it felt like a memory of water. Just beyond the sleepy edges of Kerazoo, a town that had once bustled with railroads and miners. Now, home to wind-worn barns, and a population mostly made of ghosts and folks too stubborn to leave, lay the cracked ribbon of Highway 380 snaking across an arid stretch of ochre dust and scattered mesquite. It was here, on a scorched afternoon in late July, that Dr. Hank Mitchell pressed his old Chevy truck to a slow crawl, squinting against the glare as something in the sand caught his eye. Hank Mitchell was 72, tall and sinewy, with a weathered face the color of sandstone and a permanent squint forged by decades beneath desert skies. Once a field veterinarian known from Texas to Arizona for his steady hands and unflinching calm. He had retired 5 years prior after a stroke stole some of the finesse from his left arm. His neighbors remembered him not only for his skill with animals but also for the quiet decency with which he carried the grief of losing his only son in Afghanistan. Since then, Hank had become a man of routine. Coffee at dawn, crossword by noon, evening walks with his dog's empty leash still looped around his wrist. Today was meant to be like any other, until he saw the shape lying just beyond the cactus line, unmoving under the full cruelty of the sun. He pulled over, engine ticking in protest, and stepped into the heat with slow, cautious strides. The closer he got, the more impossible the sight became. An elephant. An Asian elephant. Judging by the smaller ears and domed head, collapsed in the dust, every bone visible beneath its cracked, gray hide. Flies swarmed around open patches of flesh where the skin had given way to sores. Its breath, if there was any, was so shallow it made the body look like a sculpture more than a creature. A weathered metal cuff, too small now against its emaciated leg, clung just above the ankle, rusted and tight. Hank crouched beside the massive animal, his old knees groaning. He placed a dry hand on the elephant's flank. It was warm, barely. Then a miracle. The flank rose, slowly, painfully. The elephant was alive. "Jesus," Hank murmured. "How the hell are you still hanging on, big fella?" He scanned the area. No truck tracks, no other animals. This elephant hadn't wandered here. It had been dumped. Maybe fell off some illegal transport convoy, maybe left behind when it could no longer stand. Hank had seen cruelty in many forms during his years in practice. But this was abandonment so complete it rang like violence. He reached for his belt and took out his canteen, lifting the elephant's trunk, which lay limp like an abandoned rope. He poured a trickle of water into the open end. At first, nothing. Then a slow, faint contraction. Swallow. He poured more. The eye opened dry, sunken, but watchful, intelligent, pleading. "I'm not going to let you die here," Hank whispered, voice cracking with something he hadn't felt in years. A jackrabbit darted in the brush behind him, and Hank didn't flinch. The heat wrapped around them like a silent audience. Carefully, he checked the creature's gums, white as chalk, dehydrated, on the verge of organ failure. Yet the creature breathed, and that was enough. He could have called animal control. They would have come with sedatives and a euthanasia kit. That would be the efficient thing. But Hank Mitchell hadn't saved lives for 3 decades just to watch one slip away on his doorstep. He stood up, wiped sweat from his brow, and muttered, "To hell with protocol." He returned to his truck and pulled out the emergency veterinary kit he hadn't touched in years. Saline, antibiotics, a portable solar IV pump. He was about to attempt something absurd: field stabilization of a dying elephant in the middle of the desert with no backup and half a gallon of water. Hank rigged a makeshift canopy using a tarp and fence posts from his truck bed to provide shade. He inserted the IV port with slow hands, murmuring to the elephant the way he used to calm colicky foals and panicked dogs. The elephant made no sound, but its breathing changed, slightly more regular, more present. Night fell slowly over the desert, the temperature plummeting. Hank wrapped the elephant's midsection with blankets from the truck bed and lit a small fire nearby, not for warmth, but for light. He ate a protein bar and offered another to the elephant, who ignored it. The trunk twitched once toward the fire, then dropped. Hank lay beside the animal, using his jacket as a pillow and the silence as his blanket every so often. He checked the IV drip, the breath rate, the pulse at the massive neck. The stars above Kerazoo looked closer than usual, like they, too, were holding vigil. At some point in the middle of the night, the elephant turned its head ever so slightly toward him. Its eye caught the firelight and shimmered, not with wild fear, with something else, something Hank hadn't seen in a long time. Trust. The sun had already begun its climb over the Kerazoo plains, casting long, harsh shadows across the scrubby land. The breeze carried nothing but dry dust and the memory of cooler mornings long gone. At the far edge of town, behind an old cattle fence and a weathered dirt road, the land flattened into a stretch of hard-packed earth. It was there, just beyond the reach of anything paved, that Lacy Greer stood, still as a whisper, watching. She was 9 years old, with sun-kissed skin, bare knees, and hair that never stayed in one place. Her eyes were deep gray, too old for her age, and her expression never seemed to shift from that quiet, unreadable calm. It had been over a year since she had last spoken, since the night her father, Micah Greer, was taken from her in a crash she never saw but felt in every breath after. That silence had stayed not out of fear, but something heavier, a silence that curled around her like armor. She lived just 3 dirt paths away from Dr. Hank Mitchell's property. In a trailer her mother tried to keep clean, though the world rarely made it easy. Her mother, Emily, worked mornings and nights, trying to keep food on the table and grief off her daughter's shoulders. But Lacy didn't cry, didn't ask questions. She just wandered. That's what she was doing the first time she saw it. She had taken the back route, cutting between mesquite and sun-bleached barbed wire, following the familiar shortcut that led past Hank's place. She had seen the man before, hunched over tools or pushing a wheelbarrow, always alone. He looked like the kind of man who'd been talking to himself long before the world gave him a reason. But that morning, something was different. A structure had appeared behind Hank's shed, makeshift, patched together from tarps, poles, and salvaged wood, a canopy, almost like a temporary shelter, stretched across a rectangular area cleared of brush beneath it. Lacy saw movement, slow, heavy movement. She moved closer, careful not to kick stones or snap a branch. What she saw made her breath catch in her chest. An elephant, not a statue, not a painting, a real elephant, lying on its side, ribs showing beneath dry, cracked skin. One eye half-lidded beneath the haze of dust and pain. Wires trailed from its flank to a solar battery box. A drip line swayed from a nearby post. A plastic water trough had been pulled close to its trunk. The sight rooted her feet to the ground. She didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. She returned the next day and the next, every morning, just after her mother left. Lacy slipped out the back and made her way along the same path, stopping just before the edge of the shelter. Always the same spot. Always silent. From there, she could see Hank move in and out of the canopy, checking the IV bag, brushing away flies, adjusting the blankets he'd thrown over the elephant's side when the night turned cold. Sometimes he talked to it, low and quiet, like it was the only creature on Earth that could understand him. The elephant didn't move much, just blinked, breathed, survived. Lacy didn't wave, didn't call out, she just stood there. A small figure in the wind, tucked behind the sagebrush, watching. By the 5th day, she brought something with her, a drawing, crumpled in her pocket, of an elephant beneath a bright yellow sun. She didn't show it, just held it tightly in her hand as she stood in silence, eyes fixed on the massive creature resting beneath the tarp. Once, the elephant's eye shifted, looked directly at her. Lacy held her breath. She didn't move. Then the trunk shifted, barely. A twitch. A sign. She came back again the next day, and again, and never said a word. The morning sun filtered down in threads of gold, broken by the fraying edges of Hank's weathered tarp. The makeshift canopy rustled quietly over the elephant's massive form, casting soft shadows that stretched and yawned with each breath he took. The elephant, now with a name, lay in the same place, but something had changed. Not in the way he looked. He still appeared gaunt, his ribs visible like ridges of an ancient map. But his breath had a rhythm now, steady and unbroken. His trunk twitched more often. His ears, though heavy, would flick at passing flies. Small signs, yes, but unmistakably signs of life, and Hank Mitchell noticed something else, something he couldn't write into a medical chart. It had to do with the girl. Lacy Greer still came every morning, same spot, same silence, but the elephant, whom Hank had begun calling Solace, privately, at first, responded to her in ways he didn't to anything else. The difference was subtle, but as a man who'd spent 40 years reading the unspoken language of animals, Hank didn't miss it when Lacy was there. Solace's breathing slowed, deepened. His trunk sometimes lifted slightly, curling inward, a twitch of recognition. He blinked more often, and once or twice, even moved his tail in the barest sweep of motion across the dirt. It was as if the stillness of the girl meant something equally still inside the elephant. And in that silence, they recognized each other. Hank hadn't spoken to Lacy yet, not directly. He'd nodded to her, acknowledged her quiet presence with a tilt of his hat, but never broken the silence she seemed to cling to like skin. He understood that kind of quiet. He remembered the first month after his son, Jamie, was killed overseas. How words felt like betrayal. How even speaking aloud felt like inviting the pain in deeper. So he left the silence alone. But he watched. He watched the way she'd fold her hands in her lap and not move for 20 minutes. He saw how her eyes followed every shift in Solace's breathing. She was more patient than any vet tech Hank had ever worked with. More careful, more present. By the 9th day, Hank had started leaving an old folding chair under the edge of the tarp's shadow, angled slightly away from Solace, but within view. He didn't say anything, just set it there. Lacy used it the next morning without hesitation. She sat with her hands clasped in her lap, legs swinging gently beneath the chair, and remained for nearly an hour. Solace stirred 3 times. On the 12th day, a new character entered the story. Hank had driven into town for supplies, more fluids, antiseptic, and a portable misting fan. The heat was climbing dangerously again when he returned to the shelter. He found a figure standing near the edge of the tarp, a tall woman with pale, freckled skin, loose-fitting jeans, and a faded green park ranger's shirt. Her name was May Holland, a wildlife officer assigned to Lincoln County, late 30s, wiry build, hair always pulled back in a tight bun. Her reputation around town was practical, no nonsense, and a bit too serious for anyone under retirement age. But May had reasons. Her older brother, once a wildlife biologist, had vanished during a desert survey 12 years ago. She never talked about it, but it lived in her eyes, quiet, unresolved grief that made her a little too attached to rules. May was standing with her arms crossed, looking down at Lacy, who had frozen like a rabbit in a clearing. Hank parked and walked up. "Cautious, she yours?" May asked. Jerking her chin toward the girl, Hank shook his head. "Neighbor's kid, comes by, watches." May didn't smile. "You realize you're in direct violation of at least 3 wildlife codes just by harboring this elephant, right? I'm aware. Why haven't you reported it?" Because reporting it would have meant someone else deciding whether he deserved a chance to live. May glanced at the elephant, whose eyes remained half-closed but alert. "And what is this?" she asked, gesturing at the IV, the tarp. The girl. "This," Hank said slowly, "is a field hospital, temporary." She stared at him a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she crouched beside the elephant and extended her hand, not to touch, just to let him see. Solace's trunk moved faintly, brushing the dirt, then fell still again. "He's responding," May murmured. "That's rare." Hank nodded, especially to her. He looked at Lacy, who sat unmoving on her chair. Solace's trunk twitched again. That evening, just as the sun bled into the western sky, Hank heard it, a voice, small, hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in a year. "Solace." He turned, heart thudding in his chest. Lacy was still in her chair. She hadn't looked at him. Her hands were still folded, but her lips had moved, her voice, if that soft breath of a word could be called that, had risen just above the wind. Hank didn't speak. He didn't want to break the spell, but Solace did. The elephant gave a low, rumbled breath, not quite a trumpet, not quite a groan, a sound of recognition, and for the first time, Hank allowed himself to hope. The dawn came softer that morning, wrapped in a pale mist that clung to the ground like it didn't want to leave. The sky over Kerazoo was a faint lavender, the kind that came only after rain teased the desert overnight and then vanished without a trace, in the clearing behind Hank's land, under a tarp that had grown into a small miracle of poles, blankets, and patched plastic. The elephant, known as Solace, shifted his weight, pushed one leg forward, and stood. It wasn't a graceful motion. It wasn't even entirely successful. The back legs quivered, and he swayed like an old tree learning how to be wind again. But for the first time since Hank had found him dying near the highway, Solace got up on his feet and held himself there, tall and trembling. Hank dropped the wrench he was using to repair the water trough and whispered, "Good Lord, Lacy," sitting nearby on her usual folding chair with a faded notebook in her lap. Froze. Her eyes widened, and she stood slowly, afraid that any sudden movement would collapse this fragile moment. Her lips parted, as if a breath alone could tip the balance. Then Solace shifted again, steadier now, one step, then another. Dust kicked up beneath his broad feet as he moved just a few feet, then turned, and let out a breath that sounded like a sigh carried through a canyon. It was rebirth, and it rippled outward. Later that day, Emily Greer stepped into Hank's makeshift enclosure for the first time. Emily was in her late 30s, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones softened by the exhaustion that clung to single mothers like second skin. Her dark blonde hair was always tied up loosely, and her clothes looked perpetually covered in laundry detergent dust and motel linen threads. She was a woman who kept her grief folded inside and masked it with routines. Coffee exactly at 6:15, packed lunch at 6:30, out the door by 6:45. But this morning she had taken time off. She had heard what Lacy said. Her daughter had begun speaking again, quietly, mostly in whispers, but words nonetheless. Solace. Walk. He's awake. And Emily, who had spent the past year listening to a silence more deafening than screams, came to see for herself. She didn't say much that first visit, just stood beside Hank with arms folded, watching as Solace took another few steps, and Lacy stood nearby with a steady presence that was more than any child her age should have carried. Hank handed her a feed scoop filled with softened produce. Emily blinked. "You want me to try it," he said simply. She walked to the edge of the tarp, held out the scoop. Solace turned, ears fluttering slightly, and slowly reached his trunk forward. It hovered, then wrapped around the scoop gently and brought it to his mouth. Emily let out a breath. Well, I'll be damned. That was the beginning of something new. Over the following week, the Greers became part of the daily rhythm. Emily helped clean the troughs, monitored Solace's progress, and began sketching out a new feeding schedule on Hank's chalkboard. Lacy, encouraged by her mother's quiet presence, spoke more. Not full conversations, but enough. Enough to give shape to what she had been holding in. Solace took more steps each day. Then came the townsfolk. It started with Darrell King, the postman, who paused one afternoon when he saw Emily outside the enclosure with a hose and a stack of leafy greens. Then Marla Tyndale, the town librarian, who brought a children's book on elephants and sat reading aloud by the edge of the fence while Solace bathed in dust. Soon, people who had barely spoken to Hank in years began stopping by. Some brought water, some brought fruit. Others just stood, in reverent silence, watching the creature who had somehow survived and now stood as tall as memory. The story reached Raymond Clark, a local reporter known for covering cattle auctions and school board disputes. He had wiry gray hair, an old Nikon camera he refused to replace, and a tendency to lean too close when people spoke. But he had a heart for lost causes and showed up on the 12th day after Solace stood. Raymond interviewed Hank and Emily, and even got a cautious nod from Lacy. He took photos of Solace walking, of Lacy holding out her hand, of Hank with one palm resting on Solace's side like he was steadying a piece of the earth. The article, titled "The Elephant Who Waited," ran in the Sunday paper and then, somehow, made its way online. And then everything changed. By the end of the week, Hank had received emails from conservation groups, sanctuaries, and curious onlookers as far as Oregon and New York. Donations trickled in, modest at first, then larger. A portable medical tent arrived in a crate, courtesy of an animal relief nonprofit. The town, once sleepy and overlooked, had become the backdrop of something unexplainably beautiful. Through it all, Lacy began smiling again. She didn't say much to the visitors, but to Hank, and to her mother, and most of all to Solace. Her voice came more naturally now, like an old path being walked again. She asked questions, helped with feeding, even answered Raymond's second round of questions in full sentences. Emily cried once, silently, behind the tarp when Lacy told her, "I think he's trying to be happy again." "You mean the elephant?" Emily asked. Lacy looked at her. "All of us." And the next Monday, Lacy returned to school. The morning of the farewell came with the kind of silence only desert towns know, neither mournful nor tense, but suspended, like the sky itself was holding its breath. The canopy Hank had once rigged from old tarps and fence posts was now replaced by a proper veterinary tent donated by a sanctuary group from Colorado. The dirt had been cleared, leveled. Wildflowers planted by local schoolchildren bloomed stubbornly in the hot, dry earth. Banners fluttered gently in the wind. Safe Journey, Solace, the Western Wildlife Foundation, based out of Colorado Springs, had arrived in 2 trucks and a trailer. The foundation's lead coordinator, Dr. Benjamin Cole, was a tall, polite man in his late 40s, with neat gray slacks, glasses perched permanently at the bridge of his nose, and the type of careful tone used by people who've learned to speak with donors and broken animals alike. He meant well, his voice always calm, his clipboard always full, but there was a mild impatience in him, the kind that builds in people who've seen too many failures and want desperately to prevent one more. He had driven all the way from Colorado with his team to relocate Solace to a high-elevation sanctuary. Cooler weather, regulated feeding, open roaming fields, and other elephants who had survived trafficking or neglect. It was a haven, a perfect future, on paper. Except no one had asked Solace. Hank stood beside the open trailer, arms folded, watching as the loading ramp clanked into place. Solace stood just a few feet away, trunk lowered, tail still. Unmoving, he wasn't scared, he wasn't anxious, but his entire body gave off one clear message. No. Lacy stood nearby, her school backpack forgotten by her feet. She was dressed in her favorite soft yellow hoodie, hair braided neatly by Emily that morning. She hadn't said much since the truck arrived. Neither had Solace. Dr. Cole adjusted his glasses. "We've administered the mild sedative as advised. It shouldn't make him drowsy, just calm." "He's calm," Hank said. "He's also not moving." Cole offered a half-smile. "He may need a little coaxing. It's a new environment." Lacy stepped forward and placed her hand against Solace's thick leg. "He doesn't want to go." Cole hesitated, crouched slightly, speaking with the gentle tone he reserved for children. "He'll make friends. Sweetie, there are 3 other elephants there who—" "He doesn't want other elephants," she said. Firmer now, he wants to stay at that. Solace shifted, slowly, with a weight that carried more meaning than motion. He turned, not toward the truck, but toward Lacy. His trunk lifted, reached out, and gently coiled around her wrist. Not tight, not tugging, just a touch, a reminder. Then, without warning, Solace turned away from everyone and began to walk. The trailer was forgotten. Dr. Cole stumbled in surprise as Hank blinked against the rising dust. Lacy followed, instinctively, without being called. The crowd of onlookers, neighbors, students, even May Holland from Wildlife Services, parted as the girl and the elephant walked side by side, slow and sure, toward the open land behind the Greer trailer lot. They passed the back fence line, through brittle sagebrush and stretches of earth that had once been picked clean by overzealous mining companies in the 80s. Long ago, this patch had been cleared by a gravel company that never bothered to restore the land. The earth was dry, scarred, and cracked, a forgotten wound behind the town. Solace walked until they reached the edge of an old gully, where tufts of grass had begun to return. Aided by the recent shade from Hank's overflow tarp system and Lacy's regular habit of watering wild sprigs with her school thermos, then he stopped. He released her wrist, and he knelt. There, in the silence, something changed. Lacy dropped to her knees beside him and placed both hands on the dry soil. This is where he wants to grow things. Emily, standing at the edge with Hank and the others, brought a hand to her mouth. Hank stepped forward, voice low. This was the old Anderson dig site. Been abandoned 20 years. Thought nothing could grow here. But Lacy had planted seeds, sunflower, marigold, milkweed, all taken from a school science project she never turned in. And now, beneath Solace's shadow, a dozen green shoots had cracked the surface, stubborn and soft and very much alive. Dr. Cole stared, clipboard hanging loosely at his side. We weren't expecting this. No one was. Hank said, not even him. Cole paused, looking between them. What do you want me to tell the board? Tell them he's not a specimen. He's a survivor. And he's already found his sanctuary. The decision came quickly after that. The town council, in a rare, unanimous vote, agreed to set aside 5 acres surrounding the clearing for a micro-reserve. May Holland offered the legal paperwork. Raymond Clark wrote a follow-up piece titled "The Elephant Who Chose to Stay." Donations tripled overnight. The site was fenced, but not with cages, just natural barriers and observation posts. A local artist built a wooden sign that read, "Solace Grove, a place to heal." Schoolchildren planted wildflowers. Emily and Hank alternated feeding schedules. And Lacy, now speaking daily, sometimes even laughed. Solace remained, gentle and watchful, and Kerazoo, once a footnote on a forgotten highway, became a place people visited not for what had been lost, but for what had been found. In the quiet heart of a forgotten desert town, an elephant named Solace reminded us of something the world too often forgets. That healing is not always found in hospitals or sanctuaries far away, but sometimes it's in the presence of those who choose to stay. Sometimes. The real miracle isn't survival, but the choice to grow again where no one believes anything can. Maybe it wasn't just chance that brought Solace to that patch of broken land. Maybe it was God's way of showing us that even in the most desolate corners of our lives, hope can take root. Maybe Solace was never just an elephant. Maybe he was a whisper from heaven, a reminder that we are never truly forgotten, never beyond restoration, and in that same spirit. Let this story remind you, no matter how broken, how distant, how silent you feel, God sees you, and He sends comfort, often in the form of something unexpected, like a child's quiet love, or an old man's decision to care, or even a wounded creature who chooses to stay. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope. Leave a comment below. What did this story mean to you, and if you believe in the power of second chances? Type Amen in the comments to honor Solace and all those still fighting to find where they belong. Subscribe for more real stories of faith, healing, and the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. And may God bless you wherever your journey leads.